Well, greetings, everybody. This is Jim Wickens from NFL Draft Fanatics. I am here today with Corey and Will, and we are going to be going through the draftable tight ends for the 2024 NFL Draft. So, Will, you want to take a few minutes, introduce yourself, and tell people where they can find you?
Sure. You may know me as the curmudgeonly Accidental Zen on Twitter. Always willing to engage in a football argument before 6 o'clock in the morning. Also, for several years now, I've run a Steelers-related podcast. I founded the longest running Steelers podcast in the universe, the Steeler Fury Show, Steeler Fury Pittsburgh Steelers Show. You can find wherever you find your podcasts. And also SteelerFury.com is a Steeler fan website. We absolutely do a lot of Steeler coverage, of course, during the year. But this time of the year, we do a lot of draft stuff. We have a very famous, 32-person mock draft that we've been doing before even things like Twitter drafts existed. And also since the pandemic started in 2020, we do something very unique that's similar to something you're going to be doing, Jim. I'll give you a setup here. And that is we do what's called Draft a Team, where we have something like 20 or between 20 and 25 GMs select an entire starting team, both offense and defense, which requires knowledge of maybe 500 prospects, 600 prospects. So if you want to find out deep way in the draft, that's the kind of thing to follow, and that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Corey, you want to take a few minutes and tell people where they can find you?
You can find me at SC_draft. I am Will's co-host on the Steelers Fury podcast. I write articles for SteelersFury.com, and that's where you can find me.
Okay. And as Will said, so this is all of these podcasts right now are primers for the combine, trying to identify players and generally speaking, are they a day 1, day 2, or day 3 player? And then to kind of summarize every position on Wednesday and Thursday of this week, we are doing a draft a starting 11. So on Wednesday, it's a starting 11 defense. There will be 6 guests that will each be drafting a starting 11 defense. On Thursday, it will be 6 guests drafting a starting 11 offense. And the sum of those 2 podcasts will be approximately the top 130 offense and defensive players entering the combine. So if you're watching the combine and you're trying to figure out, is that player draftable, you'll have the opinions of 6 people to say whether or not they're in the top 130. So hopefully that should be a lot of fun. It's the first year that NFL Draft Fanatics has done that. And then in conversations with Will, I had found out that he had been doing it for years. So, there's a really good chance in 2025 that a draft simulator will be designed to do it for us. So we don't have, like this year, we're using a spreadsheet. Next year, I'm hoping the simulator can help out.
You're trying to replace us with AI, aren't you? Just like the rest of the world.
I try. I absolutely try. Okay, so guys, let's talk about tight ends for a little bit. And let's start with the list on the left. So first of all, for the audience, the list on the left is consensus. That means you look at multiple sites. The list on the left is where the draftable grades are. The list on the right, some people have a draftable grade on and some people don't. So let's start with the list on the left. And Corey, how many of those guys do you see going in the first round?
Obviously Bowers is concrete. He's going in the first round. I think Jatavion Sanders might get in there. I would have thought that Ben Sinnott might have gotten in there before. I would still, if I'm in the back half of the 20s, I would still feel fine taking him. But because he didn't explode at the Senior Bowl and he's not going to be a dynamic tester, I don't think he gets in there. So I'm going to say Bowers for sure. Sanders wouldn't surprise me at all. If he runs well, that's going to be a big decider, because he's down the seam receiving threat. But I think 1, maybe 2.
Okay. And Will, how about you as far as first round?
I agree with most of that. I think Ben Sinnott might test better than you think, especially for a lot of the analytics type teams, especially people doing the fantasy world are familiar with height adjusted speed score, which has traditionally been a measurement for receivers being able to be productive in the NFL, and pretty useful for tight ends. I think Ben Sinnott right now, I expect him to have maybe a top 5 height adjusted speed score. So that's kind of like your weight and your height, times your speed, or something along those lines. So he will be, even though he's not the biggest guy, I expect him to run fast enough to be able to score well in that. So it's possible that Ben Sinnott might. I think he's more of a second round guy, but I do think that Sanders will either sneak in the end of round 1 or very early on round 2. The other guy that might sneak in there would be Kate Stover for me. Once again, it's subject to testing. I feel like when people say the combine is only a very small piece of the puzzle, well, yes, unless you run a lot faster than people think you are, and have other tape and great things about your game that he does. So he's for a team looking for a real traditional tight end to be able to both block and be a receiving target, he would be maybe the best one in this draft. Not named, I don't know, either him or Ben Simmons, but I would think Stover maybe has a little bit better pedigree.
Okay, and then as you guys kept saying the back half of the first round, I was like thinking, okay, who are the last 10 teams, right? So thinking of the playoff teams, like the Texans, the Cowboys, and the Bengals. And the Bengals obviously are not a playoff team, but to me, those are 3 teams that would immediately resonate that may have tight end high on their needs list.
Yeah.
Do you see any of those guys as a good fit for any of those 3 teams?
I think Sinnott really could play. I mean, I'm a huge Sinnott fan. I've been a huge Sinnott fan since last year. I think the thing that's really appealing about him, he plays in the slot, he plays in line, he plays H, and he plays fullback. He plays everywhere, and he can block from all those positions. He's a good move blocker. He can come down. He's not a killer, like down blocking from an inline spot, but he is a killer from a fullback and an H-back spot. So he's good on the move blocking. I could see him, and he's reliable. I could see the Bengals liking that. You don't know where they're going with their offense necessarily, with Callahan going, but I could see them liking that. I could see the Texans, depending on if they want to get back into more of a fullback game, I could see them liking that as well. Sanders, I don't know if he fits that well with any of those teams, honestly. All those 3 fits seem a little dicey.
Will, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I heard, where do you think, I guess let me ask you a question before I answer. Where do you think Brock Bowers goes in round 1? If we left out teams out of it, where do you feel he ranks? Because, if Brock Bowers, even though we agree he's the best tight end, maybe he doesn't go until the mid of the first round anyway. And if that's the case, then I could see a team like Cincinnati moving up to get him. That feels like a fit for them. Sanders, purely as a receiving target, if you don't even look at anything else, got to be valuable to somebody that plays that way. But some of the teams he would be complete miss for, because he's not somebody who's going to be versatile, lining up in different places like Sinnott, or all around tight end. So I think that's a tough fit unless you find the right team that's really into this receiving target, like somebody like the Rams, the Miami, that's more geared that way. I would think would love a player like Sanders.
I'm glad you pointed out the Miami tight end, because that one escaped me at the back of the first round. But I agree with the need and the fit there. That makes sense to me.
I love him. I mean, by the way, to me, he's like a guy that pops every time he watches the tape. But you might not notice his weaknesses. They don't pop as much, but they're there. But I love him as a prospect.
Okay, so as far as Sanders, Stover, Sinnott, if they don't go round 1, you would definitely see them going by the end of day 2.
Yeah, with Stover's got the pedigree. That's the thing with Stover. I'm a little concerned about his 40. He seemed a little, cumbersome at times this year. Thing is with Stover is he catches everything. Like, he's a vacuum. You could throw him, 2 linebackers draped on him, and he comes down with the ball. So between playing at Ohio State, pretty solid production numbers, good blocker. I don't think he gets out of round 2. I wouldn't be shocked if he did, especially if he runs slow. Sanders, don't think he's getting out. Sinnott is going to depend on that combine. If it's bad, maybe round 3. but I think a team's going to value that versatility. And I mean, he was essentially the number one target at Kansas State for most of this year, where, you know, he was their hot answer. He was Will Howard's first guy he looked at. So that's valued, you know, especially with the versatility.
Okay. Any other players on the list on the left that you think are day 2 picks?
I would say that there's 3 in here for me that have a chance to get there. I just don't know how people are going to perceive them after the combine. But going into the combine, I would say that Brevin Spanford, Jared Wiley, and Dallin Holker all have a chance to sneak in the end of day 2. Holker, you know, I feel like he's a tough value. He's a wonderful player on tape. Question is about the competition level, of course, because he's not coming from a place like Ohio State, right? Jared Wiley is a great receiving target. He's not as much of an all-around player, but pretty good on that part of the game. And Brevin Spanford for me is maybe one of the most intriguing. I think you hear this phrase a lot, make a better pro than a college player, because I feel like his skill set is very versatile and might work better in a, you know, when they put the hash marks in the NFL and things get a little bit more congested. I feel like that actually helps his game because he's a wonderful blocker, maybe just not the quickest. So he's a player that can thrive in more congested situations, and he's going to test really well, I think.
Okay. Corey, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I was extraordinarily high on Darnell Washington last year, and I was talking to Will earlier. I think Brevin Spanford is kind of like a mini Washington. Big guy. He can, you know, really good inline blocker, which is something that, you know, is kind of missing right now in the NFL. You've got, you know, who's the Lions tight end Brock Wright, who plays a ton of snaps just because he's a great inline blocker. Brevin Spanford, and it's the same thing as Washington. I think his yak ability is a little slept on, where he can run over guys, he can hurdle guys, he can make some noise after the catch. Now, you know, the Steelers didn't utilize that with Darnell Washington this year, but if there's a team who does, having that guy in a play action kind of system who can block really well, you're not even thinking about that guy leaking out. All of a sudden, he's got 30 yards of green grass and a 205-pound safety in front of him. So that's a guy where I think he'll test well. I agree with Will. I think he's going to jump well. I think he's going to run fast. Not sure on the agilities, you know, but I think teams end up favoring the, you know, explosion numbers more anyways.
Okay. And then the list on the right, any of those guys, day 2 guys? And forget Wiley because I forgot to take him off the list.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do that.
I think Tanner McLaughlin is a guy who could get in there. He's weird. He doesn't get that much noise in kind of draft Twitter, and I haven't really even seen much noise on him kind of on like the draft websites or anything like that. But he could run pretty fast, and he's got some really nice receiving tape. He's got the frame to be a really good blocker. It wouldn't surprise me if he went over, you know, let's put it this way. If he was the 3rd or 4th tight end drafted, wouldn't surprise me if a team loved him that much.
Right. I mean, once again, it's fit, right? So like we were saying with Sanders before, Sanders could go lower than we were expecting or higher just based on a team that he really fits, because he won't fit every team. And I feel that Tanner McLaughlin's similar, not as good on the high, you know, the high end of the tape for what Sanders does as a receiver, but pretty close. But maybe has a bit more blocking, like you said, frame and effort. You can see that this guy maybe having some upside as a blocker. I think I was actually kind of surprised that he got a combine invite in a way, because he's a player that started at a small school. I think it was at Southern Utah, and generally, you know, had this theory that they basically establish your combine invite when your arrival's 4-star or, you know, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. If you're not, you pretty much have to, like, you know, lift mountains to get yourself to a combine invite. Whereas you can be pretty bad and still get a combine invite as a highly, you know, high school recruit. So I think the mere fact that he made it to the combine tells you that there's teams who think very highly of him.
And then a guy I think we should probably mention, because he's a he's an interesting prospect, and he falls into this category that we've been talking about. Like, some teams are going to love him, some teams aren't. Jaheim Bell is going to be very polarizing, I think. Will knows I love that 2022 South Carolina team. I had 8 guys on that team pretty much, and I liked him more when he was there.
Yeah.
I think what I'm kind of concerned about now is kind of what his role is, especially in the NFL, because he's he'd be classified as a gadget guy. He's a tight end who's not a great blocker, and then he's not a great separator. But, he's a big guy who can run. He can move. He can wiggle his hips. So, you kind of hope that he's a better route runner than he is. But a lot of his production just comes off of kind of just getting open by coverage bust or just getting screens. And I'm just not sure how the contact balance and the tackle breaking ability is going to translate to the NFL. So I could see him slipping past day 2, or, he goes out and runs like a 4.41. He could go round 2, like that's what that would do for him.
But here's the thing, Corey, put it in terms of, because player that we're familiar with, Connor Hayward, Connor Hayward, there's talk that Jaheim Bell will be taken in the same range that a guy like Connor Hayward was taken in the 6th round, maybe. But that to me is crazy. Like Jaheim Bell is like a much more versatile and talented player. So it's funny how that you're going back instead of coming out last year, I think really hurt his stock.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mason Pline, Isaac Rex, Messiah Swinson, McCallan Castles, David Martin Robinson. Those are new names to me as of this podcast. So why don't we start? Will, can you do Zach Hines, and then Corey do the Mason Pline and alternate? Can you guys just introduce those guys?
Unless you want to do the opposite, Corey, would you prefer Hines or Pline?
I'll take Pline.
Okay, so Zach Hines is about to be the 3rd straight starting tight end from South Dakota State to probably be drafted. I feel like he's pretty much a lock for day 3, just because he is. We talked about a player earlier who was a really good receiver who had the potential to be a good blocker. Hines is a really good blocker who showed some potential, especially if you watch the Shrine game, to be a guy that can get down the seam and make tough catches. He made a extremely tough catch in traffic and took a big hit in the Shrine game you might have seen. So the thing is, he's got the physical tools to be a great receiver, just that he played on a team where he either had a guy in front of him who was an NFL tight end, or he had a running back who was an NFL running back and an offensive line that was great run blocking. So Hines is going to come into the league as a great blocker and have some upside as a receiver.
Okay. Corey?
So Mason Pline has a pretty unique story. So I didn't really know of him until it was towards the end of the FCS season. I think it was either round 1. I think it was round 1 of the FCS playoffs. And I'm watching the Furman game, and he had this absolutely absurd game-winning end zone catch where he went up over 2 guys, got rocked, caught it. And he had a great game that game. And he looked like he could, run with the ball, going up and catching it strong. Big dude. He's a good blocker, especially at the FCS level. And then I knew I was going to the Hula Bowl, so I was excited. Did a little research on him. This guy played basketball at Ferris State University for, I think, 3 years. Then transferred to Furman, didn't play basketball. You got to be pretty smart to transfer to Furman, by the way. That is not an easy school to get into. And, had a solid, not outstanding production, but, you kind of, it's iffy as a tight end always. But when I went to the Hula Bowl, I'm thinking, this is a basketball guy. He's going to be fast. He's going to be able to jump. Not sure on his routes. And what shocked me is that he was really able to sink his hips. He's really able to kind of nod, move people off, step on people's feet. For such a big guy and a former basketball player, it's kind of surprising that a guy like that was able to run routes how he was and separate on out routes, digs, post corners. Like he was, not just winning with strength and speed, he was winning with, agility and, snapping his head and kind of some nuance to his routes. So that really shocked me. I know he ended up he had a minor injury towards the end of that. I think he'll be fine. I don't think he was a combine invite, unfortunately, but he's still going to test really well. He's got some intriguing film. Whenever you're two-sport athlete. You spend half the year playing football, half the other, the other half. He played at Fair State. He actually played on the Fair State basketball team. He was he had decent stats. So this wasn't a guy who was just going and riding the pine and doing football workouts still. So Mason Pline is going to be a guy where he could be undrafted. You never know with some of these FCS guys, but I think he's going to test really well. He had a good showcase at the Hula Bowl, who sent a ton of guys to East West Shrine. I would assume he would have been one of them if he didn't get injured towards the end. But, he could kind of surprise people where I could see him going in like the 5th round. People are like, who the hell is this guy? Furman tight end. But he can really, he has some really nice traits. That's what I'll say.
So should we make analogies to Antonio Gates' pedigree coming out? Right, because everybody always talks about the Tony Gonzalez and the Antonio Gates. I think they each played basketball and then converted to football late. Is that a similar story?
It's almost not as similar because he still played football, which is what's crazy. He played football and started on the basketball team. He started on both. Those guys, okay. I'm pretty sure they weren't even on the team. So, I think
by the way, those not familiar with Ferris State, that's definitely a top 5 program in their division of football. So that's actually a very, very competitive conference, and to be a starter at either football or basketball in that conference, you're pretty good.
Yeah.
See, I'm familiar with the location. I lived about a quarter of my life in Michigan, but I'm still trying to question if I know exactly where Ferris State is in Michigan, even though I lived there for like the better part of like 18 years. So,
sure.
Okay, Isaac Rex is one of you want to introduce him.
Yeah, I got it. I'm a sort of a BYU is one of those schools that I wouldn't say I'm a fan of BYU, but I'm saying I watch significant amount of BYU football the last few years. In fact, the famous story is that one of Corey's biggest draft crush last year was probably Puka Nacua, the receiver that ended up being, of course, that makes you look pretty good when that's your draft crush. But I said I was watching Samson Nacua, the tight end, and I saw there's another Nacua, and he's a receiver, and wow, he looks pretty good. I mentioned to Corey like 4 years ago or something. So
we mentioned this was for draft a team where we draft the however many, it's 11 on offense, 11 on defense pretty much. And so I'm sitting there in round 28 or whatever we're on, and deep depths of the draft, we're in the 500, and he's like, there's this BYU receiver, Samson Nacua. Okay, this guy looks pretty good. He ended up sticking around in the practice squad. Will text me. He goes, yeah, watch for his little brother. He's pretty good too. I watched him. I'm like, damn, this dude's even better. And so that's what started it. But yeah, Will, in a throwaway line, just trying to give me a, receiver who's not ranked on anything. It's like, oh yeah, check out his little brother.
Check out this guy. So Isaac Rex is a guy that was the guy that they looked to a lot, right? So he was injured, I believe, the year that I'm sorry, what was the quarterback that went to the Jets? I'm trying to forget his name, Zach Wilson. Mm-hmm. So the year that Zach Wilson kind of came to prominence and they were undefeated or whatever, I think Isaac Rex missed most of that season, if I'm not mistaken. So he didn't get the airtime that might have elevated his draft stock a little bit, but he is in a very a tradition that you might expect for a BYU tight end. He's a good blocker. He's a good all-around player. They played him more in line. And once again, I feel like those kinds of tight ends tend to have careers in the NFL. So I don't know that he's he'll be right at the end of the draft or a free agent. So he's not going to be higher than that probably. Also maybe a year overaged, if I remember correctly. So I think with a guy like Rex, though, you could get more out of him in the NFL. Probably he's a guy you plug in as a number 2 tight end somewhere and be very happy with his production.
Okay. Messiah Swinson. Corey, you want to introduce us to him?
Yeah, so Messiah Swinson was a guy, I had no clue who he was going into the Hula Bowl. Never heard his name, didn't really watch Arizona State, and I just kind of went in there as like just kind of watching tight ends versus linebackers one-on-ones. And there's this, guy who's making every single catch, 2 hands, taking it off guys. And, first 2 times you're just kind of like, huh, okay, good play. Then, when it happens a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh time, you're like, okay, now I've got to start writing this guy's name down. This is a guy who I've got to keep an eye on. And he kind of reminded me, the name's escaping me last year. He was at East West Shrine, guy who won all his one-on-ones. But what really impressed me with him was he blocked really well. Like, he was good in pass pro, like an offensive tackle, like stepping back, deflecting a linebacker. And then he was also a good run blocker. And I can't remember the guy's name. He ended up, I think he got drafted. He stuck around on a team. But that's what Mosiah Swinson reminds me of. If you can block, especially in pass pro nowadays, you've got some of these edge rushers who you need to devote 2-3 guys to a play sometimes. That's becoming a more important feature, like a more important ability. So for him to be able to do that, block traditionally, almost like an offensive tackle, be able to come down and down block, he's pretty fast. He can get to the edge. He can block guys in space. Plus, just having really strong, dependable hands. That's going to be a guy who's going to find a spot as a number 3 tight end. And then I didn't see any reason. I mean, he looked like he should be able to play teams. He's on all the special teams at Hula Bowl. This is a guy who, he's not a sexy prospect, but he's a guy who will be your tight end 3 for 8 years or something like that. Come in, guy gets injured, he can do everything you ask your normal guy to do. So that's Mosiah Swinson for you.
Yeah, and I think I want to transition what Corey just said. So to me, tight end is probably the most difficult position for a rookie to have success. For anybody listening to the podcast, so Sam Laporta and Dalton Kincaid had the second and third best rookie receiving years for a tight end. And the player that they were competing against, his name is Mike Ditka. And I'm 51 years old, and I don't think Ditka ever played while I was alive. Like, he may have played in the early 70s, but meaning that what Kincaid and Laporta did this year were competing with a record that stood for the better part of 50 years. So for any tight end, anybody on this list, just to come in and make a roster, the likelihood they would have a fantasy impact in year one would be historical.
You're basically looking at just Brock Bowers, I'd say.
Yeah, but here's what I would say. The one caveat I would say with that is I think the reason that those two guys, they're good players, but one of the reasons that they were able to have such good numbers historically is that the NFL game is moving more towards what the college game is like for tight ends. So they're asked to do more or less the same thing they did in college, which makes them have more likelihood of success as a receiver coming in. This may be the start of a trend where rookie tight ends perform better as receivers than they have historically.
I would concur with that because both Laporta and Kincaid, what they had in common is they weren't playing inline tight end.
Nope.
Right? They were lining up in the slot. They were lining up off the ball, separated from the offensive tackle, whether that's in the slot or on the line. So,
hey, Jim, I want to go. Can I go off the board just for a second? Because I realize there's someone that I don't know that well, but maybe one of you guys knows a little bit better, but who I think will definitely be drafted, maybe even in the first couple of days that we don't have on our list. And that is Theo Johnson from Penn State.
Yes.
So I just wonder.
I think he was there.
He was there? I think he was there. I think we had.
Yeah,
him.
I think we skipped him.
Yeah, he was a guy.
Okay, sorry, I just didn't hear his name. We didn't talk about him at all, so that's why I mentioned him before I went back. But maybe he was there and I just missed him.
Yep, there we go.
Yep,
he was third on the list.
Oh, on the right side. Yeah, sorry, but I think I think I just skipped him. Yeah, or we skipped him. But I think we talk about the Kate Stover's pedigree from Ohio State. I think Theo Johnson's pedigree from Penn State is similar in that he'll get bumped up a little bit just because he plays in a system that's kind of resembles more like an NFL system for tight ends. He's a not frustrating player, but there's some up and down to his game, right? So he's not necessarily the most consistent guy that I watched on tape. And I don't know if there's any one skill that he has that's a real outlier skill, but I think that somebody will be intrigued by the potential of him, and I believe he'll test really well. He'll be a height weight speed guy that'll come out of the combine. being that's someone we're talking about. So I think he's worth mentioning.
Okay. And the last two. So one of you want to take McCall Castles?
I'll take him. So
Okay.
the story with McCall Castles, he's been touted as one of the better FCS players for a couple years. Then this offseason, he decided to transfer to the University of Tennessee. Now, why a tight end would ever want to transfer to Tennessee, that's beyond me. Because you're going to be sitting there and you're going to block for about 20 wide receiver screens a game. But, that was his decision. Production wasn't great this year because that's an air raid offense. They don't throw to tight ends there. And, Joe Milton struggled throwing to the middle of the field a little. So there's multiple reasons why he won't have the numbers this year. But this guy was touted very highly coming out of UC Davis, and there's a reason for that. He's very well-rounded. He can block really well. He is a threat at all three levels, which is, kind of rare for a time. There's not many guys on this list who can go out, catch underneath balls, these spot routes, these tip routes, and then also run a corner, run a seam, run an out. He can do all that. Didn't really get the opportunity transferring up. I'll emphasize again, no clue why any tight end would transfer to Tennessee. But this guy's a legitimate prospect. You kind of have to go off earlier film to see more of what he could do. But I think he's going to test reasonably well. And I think any team is probably going to be one of those West Coast teams who knew him from his time at UC Davis. That probably takes would either draft him or sign him with a priority undrafted free agent. But that's what I would assume, that one of those teams who know what he was at UC Davis ends up jumping on him.
Okay. And David Martin Robinson.
Yeah, just a quick note on him. He's an overage player. I think he had some injuries early in his career. Really only has 2 years starting, but was in college for 6 years. So that gives you an idea what the career was that he had. But he has sort of been a little bit of a buzz lately in the postseason. And I suspect he's not a guy that will get drafted, but he's a guy that will be on someone's roster for a few years. So from the fantasy standpoint, I don't think he's a fantasy guy, but I think he's a guy that's a good blocker. They used him a lot as a eight-top in motion, and he gets some movement in his blocks and has enough athletic ability to be useful. So once again, very fit-oriented, but for a team that, like, maybe not this exact team, but a team like, think of San Francisco's run game with all the motion and the getting people on the move and then asking them to locate guys to block and make blocks on them. I feel like he would be one of the stronger guys in the class at that particular skill. So there may be a role for him. He's a role player candidate going forward.
Awesome. So I appreciate everybody. We had a lot of people coming in and out of the podcast, so I appreciate everybody that came in. If you're watching this, please follow, and subscribe to the NFL Draft Fanatics YouTube channel. There will be more content coming. We're going to close this podcast out, and we're going to start a new one for running backs, and give me 10 minutes. So first of all, we also finished this in 35 minutes. So I liked how quickly we were able to go through that. So I appreciate all of that, Corey and Will. So take 10 minutes. We'll come back and we'll do running back.